I don't believe in the collapse of capitalism. I believe in the overthrow of capitalism. That the conditions of the working people all over the world, not just in the global south, but even in the global north, has never been as bad as it is now it's ever since the Second World War. That Marxism is a philosophy which can be transcended only by its vision getting realized. And that realization requires that the working people must take their destiny in their own hands. Monopoly capital in a situation of crisis actually forms an alliance with fascist elements. In India, this has taken the form of a corporate Hindutva alliance, which is currently ruling the country. You find that there is some hapless group which is identified as the other, against which hatred is generated among the majority, and that changes the discourse, because of which people are no longer talking or are made no longer to talk about bread and butter questions, employment, food, bread, but they start talking about what happened to Aurangzeb. So they change the discourse, and this helps monopoly capital. I think the crucial question in Kerala now would be, to my mind, how to withstand the onslaught of the centre, which is really denying resources to states generally and specifically also to Kerala. In other words, how do we overcome the resource shortage which has been introduced by the centre by not giving Kerala whatever is due? Well, the terror attack which took place was a real symptom of intelligence failure. In fact, this is a bit similar to even the Pulwama attack, which was really an instance of intelligence failure. So I think within the defense spending, the amount of information that we should be getting, we are not getting. Okay, somebody should be responsible for it, and somebody has evaded that responsibility. But on the other hand, I think given this, we should not immediately rush into a confrontation with Pakistan that has potentials for unleashing a war. I think that would be quite disastrous.
Professor, you have always registered your hope in collapse of capitalism and eventually a socialist society will be coming up. But now the practical reality of the economic world order, you can see that we should focus on something called techno-feudalism after capitalism, which is actually against capitalist beliefs, like they are totally against the concept of competition, profiteering, and even wage labor. And here it will be rent seeking, then again they will be focusing on free labor, market monopoly. So should we expect the worst after capitalism?
No, in fact, I would like to just make one corrective statement. I don't believe in the collapse of capitalism. I believe in the overthrow of capitalism. Okay. The other thing is that, no, in fact, on the contrary, I believe that we are on the threshold of a new order in which there is going to be a situation where people take control over their own destinies, and that would move towards socialism. So I don't see capitalism being replaced by any other mode of production, but I think it is going to be altered in a manner through popular intervention that would take us towards socialism. And I believe that is something which is historically imminent.
So do you believe in the political, now the new generation, as we call the Gen Zs, Gen Alphas, how deep do you think their political understanding will be capable of such an understanding which can help them overthrow a system like capitalism?
Well, I think the sensitive ones among them would, of course, be sensitive to the plight of the working people. Let's be very clear that the conditions of the working people all over the world, not just in the global south, but even in the global north, has never been as bad as it is now over it's ever since the Second World War. Okay, I mean, let's say in our case since decolonization, but let's say, and this is a contribution of neoliberal capitalism. Okay, so I should say has never been as bad since the inception of neoliberal capitalism. The reason is quite obvious, because in the advanced capitalist countries, the workers now, because of the relocation of activities, have been competing against the workers in the global south. In the global south, the wages are low, and therefore capital wants to shift from the global north to the global south, and they have shifted to many countries, including to China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, and so on, lots of activities. And therefore, their bargaining strength of the workers in the global north has got greatly reduced. At the same time, in the global south, all this relocation has not resulted in a using up of the labor reserves. On the contrary, the labor reserves have actually been added to, because of the fact that the crisis of peasant agriculture, of petty production that arises because of the withdrawal of state support from those sectors has thrown millions of small producers, millions of peasants and so on into distress, and many have migrated in search of non-existent jobs to urban areas, because of which the labor reserves here, far from getting used up, have actually been added to as a proportion of the labor force, and therefore the wages here continue to remain at a subsistence level. And what is more, since many people have lost their occupations and wages remain at subsistence level, you actually have an absolute worsening of poverty. Just two bits of evidence I'll give you. Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, has estimated that the real wage of an average male American worker in 2011 was marginally lower than in 1968. And in India, there is the estimate that in terms of nutritional deprivation, if you take the proportion of rural population below 2200 calories per person per day, that proportion, which was 58% in 1993-4, around the time that neoliberalism started, was 68% in 2011-12, and more than 80% in 2017-18. Similarly, the proportion of persons in urban areas who could not access 2100 calories was 57% in 1993-4, went up to 65% in 2011-12, it was around that level in 2017-18. So everywhere you have a situation where the working people are actually getting impoverished, and any person of the Gen X you're talking about who's sensitive about the conditions of the working people, and lots of them would therefore pitch his or her lot with them and start, and lead and join movements for their liberation.
Yeah, that's anyway, it's on an optimistic note. We can believe Gen Zs and Gen Alphas also to join this kind of a movement. Anyway, and Professor, my next concern, or what I'm thinking about, we have actually moved almost 3 decades after the liberalization, privatization, globalization experiment. And the flag bearers of those very concepts are now moving away from this, and they are becoming by and large more and more protectionist. They are trying to tally everything in absolute numbers, just like the Trump too is. He's actually taking like disastrous steps in that regard to make everything in tally. That too in material numbers, in quantity. He is asking for, like, you have to keep the balance sheet like equal, even. So what do you think the situation of India? How was this LPG reforms actually affected India? Has it worsened our situation? And we will always point out the technological enhancement, access to technology, a lot of other things which people actually they are now enjoying as the products of LPG reforms. So what is your take on it?
You see, I think talking about India is misleading. There is no doubt that the big capital, as well as a segment of the urban middle class, has done well out of this liberal regime. But the bulk of the working people, by which I mean the workers, the peasants, the petty producers, craftsmen, fishermen, and so on, they have actually become worse off during this period. As you know, everybody knows that inequalities have increased dramatically. So I think, in a sense, in the old days, when India was under colonial rule, you could talk about an India because everybody there, in a sense, suffered from colonialism. But now that is no longer true, because you find that a segment has done very well out of neoliberalism, while the bulk of the people have not. The only thing is that because of the crisis of neoliberalism, which has arisen since, let us say, the collapse of the housing bubble in the United States, since the crisis, many segments of the population which otherwise had been doing well are not really doing well. I mean, the rise in unemployment is really one very obvious. Youth unemployment, educated unemployment is one very obvious symptom of this. And that also generally feeds into your first question, that the Gen X may not be doing as well now as it was doing earlier.
Yeah, they are getting laid off from multinationals.
Yes, in fact, I saw the other day that even IITs and so on, their placements have dropped.
Yes, that's true. And sir,
And by the way, migration now is going to become very difficult to the United States and all these countries.
Yes, Kerala actually is suffering from that, because the number of people who are migrating the number is actually reducing in Kerala. It's not because of the things are getting better here, rather it is because the things are getting worse and over there.
And that's precisely why many of them would then say that let us make things better here.
Yeah.
And then they would join in the people's struggles.
Sir, actually, the recent state conference of Communist Party in Kerala, they have observed that what is the socio-political change in the landscape of India, what is happening right now, is to be considered as a curtain raiser of fascism. So I think you believe that it has moved further. So do you believe that fascism has already come here, or?
You see, in any case, I do not see the 1930s fascism as being the same as contemporary fascism. Not just in India, everywhere in the world, whether you take Argentina's Milei, whether you take Italy's Meloni, whether you take America's Trump and so on, it is not actually exactly a replica of 1930s fascism. But the situation that had given rise to fascism in 1930s are again in operation today. And that situation was the crisis of capitalism. Even the crisis is not identical. That time you actually had millions being thrown out of their jobs. But the crisis now takes the form of a slowdown in the economy, because of which, again, large numbers don't find the jobs that they're looking for. It's not a sudden retrenchment of millions of people. That may happen, but on the other hand, it is actually that people not finding the jobs they're looking for. So the situation of crisis always gives rise to fascism. Okay, the fascist tendency, fascist elements are always there in any modern society, but they get an encouragement when monopoly capital comes to help them. And monopoly capital comes to help them through financial support, through media support. In India, the media has been completely taken over by the fascists. And monopoly capital, in turn, has the advantage that in a situation in which people are not doing well, in a situation in which unemployment is growing and so on, in a situation of crisis, any threat to the hegemony of monopoly capital is nullified because the fascists change the discourse. You see, they start talking about some temple, they start talking about some hapless othering of a minority. It is immigrants in many of the advanced countries, Mexicans in the United States, or Chinese goods in the United States. Similarly, it's immigrants in the European countries. It's Muslims here. So you find that there is some hapless group which is identified as the other, against which hatred is generated among the majority, and that changes the discourse, because of which people are no longer talking or are made no longer to talk about bread and butter questions, employment, food, bread, but they start talking about what happened to Aurangzeb. Okay, so they change the discourse, and this helps monopoly capital. Okay, besides, you have a situation in which, in any case, joint struggles of the working people become much more difficult to organize, struggles that would combine the majority as well as the oppressed, the hated minority. So, monopoly capital in a situation of crisis actually forms an alliance with fascist elements. In India, this has taken the form of a corporate Hindutva alliance, which is currently ruling the country.
Actually, the intensification of caste prejudices, that actually is now, I think the government itself is motivating things on that line. So, how far do you think then a cooperation of the working class across caste, cutting across caste lines, is possible in India?
Well, this is the point, that the discourse is sought to be changed by the monopoly capital and the ruling elite. Okay, the point of the democratic forces is to actually bring the alternative discourse back to the forefront. And that does come about. For instance, during the peasant struggles, during the farmer struggle, the year-long farmer struggle that prevented those 3 bills from actually getting implemented, you actually have not just the Jats, the Jat Sikhs and the Jats. They were, of course, a very major component of it, but you even had Dalits joining in. So the point is that you can transcend these divisions only by uniting the people around some kind of a common agenda that appeals to everybody. You see, after all, in societies like ours, which have had millennia of caste and so on, if we are going to build a new society, then we have to actually have an alternative vision. It's not a question of simply caste arithmetic that but it's a question of transcending caste through building an alternative vision of society, where, for instance, the citizenship, the class solidarities become more important.
So, how far do you think the existing political opposition, which is actually, even though they are not to the extreme right, they are somewhere in the middle of the right only. So, do you think without a proper economic alternative, without a proper political alternative in the other side of the spectrum, will these changes be possible in India?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, neoliberalism is dead. It has nothing more to offer. It is in a state of terminal crisis. Now, I think within the and by the way, this has had its political fallout everywhere. In France, for instance, Macron, who stands for neoliberalism, is completely discredited. You have, on the one hand, the emergence of the right, that is Marine Le Pen, and on the other hand, a left alliance, which is actually done very well. In Germany, many people don't realize this. In the last German elections, if you combine the votes, everybody knows and we all know that the right is doing very well. The AfD, okay, is doing very well. But if you add up the votes of the Linke, which is the left party, along with a splinter from the Linke, which is Sarah Wagenknecht, then the two together add up to almost 14% of votes, which is the highest that actually the left has got in Germany, since I became politically conscious, So the point is that, that there is an emergence left. The center is collapsing. Now, the point is that I think we have to make sure that even within the Congress, within the centrist parties, the positions they take would not be centrist positions, but center-left positions, which in economic terms would mean not neoliberal positions, but positions for forming a welfare state. Okay, and I think the left has to take the lead in actually giving the slogan for building a welfare state in the country. And if that is the case, then I think we can actually mobilize people from centrist formations who no longer go behind neoliberalism, but are now inspired by this.
Sir, actually, up to UPA 2, we had a lot of things which right-wing economists ridicule as RRE model, redistribution, that rights and entitlements, redistribution through rights and entitlements. Do you still believe in such models of redistribution through providing rights and entitlements to people?
The only possibility of providing relief to the people is through rights. Because, you see, otherwise, by now, even Modi, who was talking about freebies, is now going around talking of giving some, in Delhi, for instance, they promised transfers to be given to women and so on. So every political party in India now, including the right-wing parties, are talking about giving some kind of dole, some kind of freebies, some kind of transfers to the working people, because of the fact that the objective situation is characterized by enormous distress of the working people. In fact, this is really a recognition, in a sense, of the failure of neoliberalism. The fact that every political formation, including the right, is now thinking in terms of giving some freebies is really symptomatic of their recognition of the complete failure of neoliberalism. And right-wing economists are about the only ones who may not acknowledge this, but everybody else is doing it. Now, the point is that all these kinds of transfers are really something which I'm not in favor of, because firstly, they degrade the status of the people. People are supposed to be grateful to you. Our party gave you so much, you better be grateful to us. What is this gratitude? People in a democracy are in fact the source of power, and therefore this whole business about largesse, that this is being given as a gift to the people, is really fundamentally inimical to the self-esteem and dignity of the people. And secondly, this is something which can be withdrawn. If the budgetary situation becomes bad, then what you gave yesterday, you withdraw today. So I would be in favor of the fact that people should be given the dignity of citizenship and therefore the dignity of a set of rights. We have got the right to various freedoms, but I think we should also introduce the right, a set of fundamental economic rights: right to employment, right to food, right to free medical facilities along a national health service, right to free education, quality education in publicly funded government schools, the right to an old age pension and disability benefits, which is a living pension. You'd be surprised to know that the central government scheme today for old people, they give 200 rupees a month, which is a joke, which is absurd. So a right to a living old age pension, non-contributory, and a right to disability benefits. From old age pension, of course, people who are entitled to get pensions from their employers would be opting out. But on the other hand, those who have no such entitlements should be getting this. So I believe the only way forward we can go now is really to institute a set of fundamental economic rights that ensures that the people are not once more pushed back into victimhood under capitalist crisis.
Sir, as a practicing economist, how far do you think we are data sufficient nowadays? Do we have data to objectively analyze what exactly is going on in our economic system?
I think
Even the census is pending.
I know, and I think the NDA government has done a great disservice disrupting our data sources. You see, India had one of the finest data sources anywhere in the world, certainly in the global south, but something like that didn't even exist in many countries of the global north. Our National Sample Survey, for instance, that Mahalanobis had set up. Now, the point is, because the National Sample Survey shows something which are not to the liking of the government. They show growing undernutrition as far as the people are concerned, while the government is claiming that so many millions have been lifted out of poverty. Then obviously the government destroys the National Sample Survey, which is what they have done. So I think there has been a real destruction of the statistical basis on the basis of which economic policies can be discussed. You're absolutely right. But on the other hand, I hope when the dust has settled and all this neo-fascism is over, you would have a situation where we can revive once more our wonderful statistical system.
But sir, without presenting these things factually before the people, without informing them what exactly is going on based on fact, how do you think a political mobilization against this is possible?
People's experience speaks a lot more than any statistical facts. You see, it is important to convince intellectuals that nutrition is growing. But on the other hand, somebody who is actually undernourished doesn't need convincing because his or her own experience supports this.
Sir, how do you look at Kerala? In Kerala, actually, I think we have old age pensions, we have disability benefits, and we are trying to make it to the living standards also. And we are trying to do all these things which actually is denied by a central government, a right-wing central government. And we do have options in the political spectrum in the left and right. Now, I think there is an emerging right-wing also is there in Kerala. How do you look altogether the socio-political landscape of Kerala?
I think the crucial question in Kerala now would be, to my mind, how to withstand the onslaught of the centre, which is really denying resources to states generally and specifically also to Kerala. In other words, how do we overcome the resource shortage which has been introduced by the centre by not giving Kerala whatever is due? And mind you, if this is an attack on all these states, particularly southern states, delimitation and so on. And this is part of the same thing. Kerala has suffered because, among other things, because it has been so successful in improving the conditions of the people that, for instance, the birth rate has come down and so on. I believe, therefore, we have to think in terms of sources of raising resources which are not which are not under the control of the central government. And therefore we have to be innovative. One thing which has always struck me, and when I was in the government here, we had mooted this idea, is that in Kerala, for instance, you have a large amount of land which is under all these plantations. The leases on which had been given by the Maharajas decades ago. Not all this land is actually used under the plantations, and therefore there is surplus land lying around, and it is one possibility for the government to estimate and take over that surplus land and use it in ways which are beneficial for the people or which can also be revenue earning. For instance, if you set up ITDC hotels and so on, not KTDC hotels and so on, in that case, that can be a source of revenue as well. So there are possibilities. In other words, there is still sufficient amount of slack in the system which we can exploit. We have to identify them, which we can exploit, and therefore prevent being pushed around by the central government.
But I think the situation of Kerala is a bit different because as you said, there are land parcels which are under the plantations, but still altogether we lack land resources because we can't rely on industrialization, and we have missed that bus also. As a country, we have missed it, and for Kerala, actually, it was not practically possible also. And above that, Kerala is actually a place with the highest wage. And do you think the investors will be interested in Kerala?
You know, the point is not having in Kerala a Gujarat style attracting investors strategy. That is not going to work. But I think Kerala has its own unique advantages. It's a highly literate and educated state. I think we talk these days so much about the knowledge economy. In fact, Kerala could actually be a hub of a knowledge economy. So we have to identify our own specific comparative advantages and concentrate on them instead of accepting a pattern of industrialization which is generally being pushed for all states and trying to live up to that, which may actually land us in trouble. That's what happened in West Bengal. You know, after all, in West Bengal, because of the fact that the left-run government tried to attract investment, and this is something that was done without taking the peasantry into confidence, and therefore it was possible for the right to mobilize, or for the anti-left elements to mobilize the peasantry against the left. And for decades the peasantry had stood with us. After all, we were in power for 34 years, and how were we in power? We were in power because of the support of the peasantry. And therefore alienating the peasantry from the left was something which the right could do, or let's say the kind of anti-left could do, because of the fact that we had a strategy of industrialization which was wrong and which again did not take peasantry into confidence.
The labor movements in Kerala are usually dubbed as excessive trade unionism, and it's always held against Kerala. Kerala is not actually friendly for investors or investment for that matter. So how do you think, or what is your take on the trade union activism in Kerala? Is it something which is to be contained?
No, on the contrary, it's very good. In fact, Kerala sets a model for the rest of the country in this regard. I think this whole idea, which recently this man Narayan Murthy has been pushing, that you kind of beat up the workers, you make them work 90 hours or 70 hours a week, and that is something which is the panacea for development, is completely bogus. It is based on a notion of development that excludes people from its purview. What's the point of development? What's the point of high GDP growth? And look at Gujarat. It has presumably a high GDP growth, but on the other hand, its human development indicators are abysmal. So what's the point of such a growth? In other words, this whole idea of a GDP growth for which you call capitalists from outside, then they say, but your wages are higher than what we can find in Himachal Pradesh or whatever in Gujarat, and therefore you lower your wages, otherwise we don't come. I think that's a completely false strategy. I mean, I think it's chasing a will-o'-the-wisp. We have to, on the contrary, take from Kerala, where we are, find out which ways we can go, find out exactly how we can strengthen the welfare state measures that already exist in this state, and so on.
So you have your personal experience with Kerala and Kerala administration. What do you think can be the most important segments on which Kerala can focus based on the socio-political and economic realities of contemporary India?
Well, okay, I mean, in terms of we had started a number of schemes. I don't know what has happened to them since then. One was that you had homeless, jobless, poor. In other words, they didn't have land and they didn't have houses, obviously, if they don't have land, and they were not employed, and so on. So that, we had thought of building some estates for them. I think we had called them K.R. Narayanan scheme, I don't know if still, where you actually rehabilitate them. Okay. Now, one of the things you can do, for instance, I was talking about taking over the land belonging to plantations. You can actually have such rehabilitation schemes where people kind of work there and have houses. So one can think in terms of schemes, but fundamentally, please, one thing which I want to make clear, the whole idea must be to provide people with living opportunities, dignified life. Do not talk about GDP to me or GSDP to me, because I think that's a completely bogus concept.
Quality of life matters than
of ordinary people. The whole idea of development is to improve the quality of life of the ordinary people. But if you say that quality has to be suppressed and deteriorated in order to have a high GDP growth, because GDP is the symptom of development, then I would say that's completely wrong.
So do you still believe in the destiny of the proletariat in finishing off capitalism?
In our country, I would say not only proletariat, but the working people, proletariat, in alliance with peasants, petty producers, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I certainly believe that. Okay, let me make one thing clear. You see, the greatest Marxist philosopher of the 20th century, George Lukács, made two statements. One statement he made is that even if every sentence Marx wrote in Capital is wrong, he would still be right. Now, what did he mean by that? He was actually talking in terms of a concept of totality. That, it's not, your individual sentences may not be right, but the totality is important. And the second thing he said is that every attempt to go beyond Marxism amounts to a reversal to some pre-Marxian trend. He said that, look, all the new left has not gone beyond Fourier. And so all those people who are talking about GDP and so on have not gone beyond Adam Smith. So that, really, that Marxism is a philosophy which can be transcended only by its vision getting realized. Okay. And that realization requires that the working people must take their destiny in their own hands. Okay. Therefore, I think we are stuck in an age in which this promised Bolshevik revolution onwards, this promise has not been fulfilled. But on the other hand, until this promise is fulfilled, we cannot move beyond the present conjuncture.
As a person who had dedicated your life to studies of Marxian economist, and actually it's considered to be a failed narrative because we don't have, post-USSR especially, it is always dubbed as a failed narrative which can't provide any practical solutions to the world's problems. What is your take on that?
What practical solution? As I told you, neoliberal capitalism was supposed to provide practical solutions, but it's now in a miserable state. Capitalism itself is now in a miserable state with Trump's tariffs being levied even against the European community and so on. There are two wars going on, wars of colonialism, that Israel, backed by imperialism, is carrying on a genocide vis-a-vis Gaza, okay, vis-a-vis the Palestinian people. In Ukraine, the effort of imperialism to push into the Soviet Union, into Russia, post-Soviet Union, is something which has actually brought about this war. And even now, large segments of imperialist interests are not concerned about finishing this war. Okay, mind you, finishing this war, they don't have any Trump doesn't have any humanitarian kind of concerns. But on the other hand, he feels that now that Zelensky and Ukraine are losing, it is better to finish it off, cut your losses. Okay. But many segments of imperialism are not willing to see that. Everywhere you find that there is a symptom of inhumanity. Fascism is arising in large numbers of countries. Everywhere there is a symptom of inhumanity. Therefore, to say that Marxism is a failed narrative but capitalism is succeeding beautifully seems to me to be just the opposite of the truth. Okay. In fact, from this state of inhumanity, we can progress only through the working people taking control over their destinies, through going beyond neoliberal capitalism, and as I said, going beyond neoliberal capitalism into building a welfare state that actually leads on to socialism.
You might have noticed the recent terror attacks in Kashmir. And I think India is a country which is a front runner in its spending in defense. So how can we explain this mismatch between the outcome and spending into defense?
Well, the terror attack which took place was a real symptom of intelligence failure. In fact, this is a bit similar to even the Pulwama attack, which was really an instance of intelligence failure. So I think within the defense spending, the amount of information that we should be getting, we are not getting. Okay. Somebody should be responsible for it, and somebody has evaded that responsibility. But on the other hand, I think given this, we should not immediately rush into a confrontation with Pakistan that has potentials for unleashing a war. I think that would be quite disastrous. Because I think it is, you see, because we must see also that in Pakistan, that there is scope for diplomacy, that in Pakistan also there would be a wing that promotes terrorism. There would also be a wing, even within the Pakistani government, that may be opposed to the support to the terrorists. So I think we should try and kind of, form alliances so that we can actually bring about a change in the Pakistan government support to the terrorists itself. Any kind of immediate war-like action might actually unite them and give rise to a lot of damage on both sides. So I would really suggest that we should have a careful, calibrated response to this, including firming up our intelligence gathering abilities.
Political weaponization of national security is actually a trend. It's common in almost every part where the right-wing politics is functioning.
Yes.
So, how far do you think it is practical in India, or how that thing is utilized in India?
Well, the right would try to weaponize this for its own purposes, but I think the task of the left and of liberal progressive opinion must be to actually guard people against such weaponization, against such kind of, knee-jerk reactions, which can actually have great damaging consequences.
So, a national level strike is declared on 20th May. And that won't get much appreciation from the liberal media, or the popular narratives of the country is not always with the labor class, the working class. What is your take on the genuinity of the cause which they are raising?
Of course, from what I've been saying, that the working class in the country has really been at the receiving end of the attacks of neoliberal capitalism. In fact, not only has it been at a receiving end, but what is more, even its ability to strike back is something which has been greatly diminished. The working class in India has gone into actions of 1-day strike, 2-day strike, and things of that kind, but not really prolonged strikes. In a sense, the kind of thing that the peasants did, the farmers did against the 3 bills, the working class has not been able to do. And the reason why it has not been able to do is that, that number of changes have taken place under neoliberal capitalism. I'll give you 3 examples. One, of course, is the rise in the reserve army of labor. In other words, obviously that weakens the working class strength. The second is the privatization of public enterprises. The public sector is really everywhere in the world. The public sector is the sector where the working classes' striking strength is most visible. If you privatize public enterprises, that's a way of disarming the working class. Okay, and think of the kind of railway strike we had, the locomen strike we had, and so on in the early 70s or mid 70s. We don't have them anymore, and I think this is to do with the privatization of the public sector. So the neoliberalism has not only attacked the working class in terms of its material life, but it has also weakened the working class in terms of its striking power. That is why I would welcome the fact that the working class is once more kind of, rising and calling this strike and so on.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.